We now turn our attention to Aristotle's epistemology and value theory, and we pause just to remind ourselves that the background information is in the PowerPoint notes which are attached to D2L, the worksheet. Remember to use the worksheet. And I've given you the indication that I think the 9th chapter of the textbook is really an outstanding chapter and more than worth reading. And this is, of course, what you need to know. So let's come on down to the basic questions. Once Aristotle has determined that he cannot use Plato's theory of innate ideas, then he's faced with the question, how do we know anything? And he'll be faced then with the question, once we work out how we know something, how do we know the truth of that for certain? How do we know it's true? How do we really know? And then there's a third question, how can all mankind know the same truth? Now, in principle, both Plato and Aristotle are fundamentalists, foundationalists. We had a previous discussion about foundationalism. I'll let you look back to that. For something to be true, it's got to be meaningfully connected to something that's real and doesn't change. But some of the objects in Aristotle's metaphysics do change. And they change their form. So, what makes things certain? But before we go there, how do we know anything at all? That's the first question. Well, Aristotle's first answer to that is, we don't know anything. Well, our minds come into this world not knowing everything as Plato said, and forgetting it because of the experience of birth, but we know nothing. Our minds begin their life journey as blank slates, tabula rasas. But how do we acquire knowledge? Well, the only answer to that is our perceptions, using the senses. Sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. And Aristotle's going to say, these repeated perceptions form impressions, and the active mind works on those perceptions and categorizes them into concepts. Let's look at that in slightly more detail. The mind develops and knows ideas. How? Repeated experiences. That is through the senses. These are impressions, perceptions. And the mind creates that mental picture. Now, here on the picture we can see the sense organ at work. This is a new impression. That creates an impression. We have repeated impressions. And we do something with those. We do things like, are they similar? Are they contrast with? We use previous perceptions. These are in our memory. And we can recall a perception. And there's a whole discussion in Aristotle on dreams, which I'm avoiding entirely. And out of those recalled impressions, we tend to form actions. So the world uses the sense organs to make the impressions. This is going on inside the mind. The passive mind is receiving this information, the active mind is processing it. It's interesting that he calls imagination the movement which results upon an actual sensation. So he sees the mind working through imaginations. In a sense, he's turning Plato's epistemology upside down. You'll recall that the lowest level of knowledge is imagination for Plato. Well, for Aristotle, he's making it the essence of the entire process. The movement which results in an actual sensation. And then I have underlined for you in the quote, an impression of the senses is pictured and retained before the mind and is accordingly the basis of memory. What I've been trying to give you here is a simple overview of his epistemology. I sort of laugh at myself when I say a simple overview because Aristotle is anything but simple. worth the effort of reading. The distinctions he makes are most interesting and well thought through. As we move on, Aristotle moves from saying this is how the mind works, and this is how we have the memory of all these perceptions organized in categories. And then he says, how does this knowledge work? Well, he says we have technical knowledge, we have ethical and political knowledge, and we have theoretical knowledge. And he notices that humans are producers of that. He says only humans do it and the gods do not produce it all. In terms of ethical and political knowledge, he says only humans are moral agents. He's excluded the gods in the question of whether they conform to morality or not. And such ethical and political knowledge is practical knowledge for a particular end. And we'll see when we come down to look at his value theory, the particular end becomes important. And then, of course, there's theoretical knowledge. Gods and humans produce this, and that's knowledge for its own sake. In other words, he says the whole gamut of thinking can be encompassed by this idea of perceptions producing senses producing perceptions, perceptions being analysed by the active mind and producing these conceptual pictures. But it doesn't end there. We have some other issues to deal with. How do we know the ideas in our mind represent what is objectively real and true? It's all very well to say I've got these ideas and these concepts, but how do they connect to reality? Aristotle argues that objective reality and truth cannot be demonstrated. In other words, he says you can't use empirical knowledge to demonstrate the truth. Why? Because to demonstrate this, you'd have an infinite number of demonstrations, demonstration after demonstration after demonstration, and even when you went on to infinity, you wouldn't have a definitive, irrefutable conclusion. So Aristotle sets upon a different path to try and find certainty, or as close to certainty as he can get. He seeks to establish immediate and implicit starting premises, in other words, first principles, things about which we are most certain. And while those most certain implicit first principles are always developing, out of those first principles, from the implicitness of those first principles, we explicitly draw out knowledge. We work from the implicit to the explicit. Now, since the objects of perception are individual things, once we form these concepts, the knowledge we have is inherently inductively produced universal knowledge. So he begins to say that it's true, at least in this theoretical sense, that we've got a universal idea that can at least theoretically apply to everybody or every circumstance in the world. But what kind of certainty does this inductive process produce? The green box, I think, is where we really are on this particular slide. How can the mind how can we be certain about these things we have in our mind, relying upon first principles which are developing, changing? Aristotle seems to say that this is an ongoing process. He has a kind of fallback position, if you will. I don't think this is a fair presentation, but at least it's a simplified one. He says a process of careful use of language and analysing on a continuing basis, and where possible, bringing in logic and mathematics. In other words, trying to surround the reasoning we have with as much technical data as possible. And so that brings us to the next question. It's the last of our big three questions. How can mankind know the same truth? What he's produced so far is conceptual universal truth inside the individual mind. But it's only inside the individual's mind. How can the individual know that the universal truth in that person's mind, in your mind or my mind, is the same universal truth in our minds. How is it the same? Now for Plato this wasn't a problem. Plato, you recall, simply said, all humans have got the same knowledge of the forms. There are the forms out there, we all know about them, and with the right education we'll all agree with what the forms say. Aristotle seems to be content with the power of language, providing the basis for humans sharing these universals. Now this topic of universals and how it relates to certainty and to knowledge is an ongoing debate, and as we move on with some of the later philosophers we'll bring these thoughts together in a more systematic way and talk about universals. At this point we're just simply introducing them to you and beginning to set the scene for them while moving on in our discussion of them and preparing the way for what's to follow. But that brings us to a point where we should pause for a moment and say, okay, we have looked at his metaphysics, we've looked at his epistemology, he's clearly looking at the big questions, he's coming up with different answers to Plato. But what's the greatest value? For Plato, the good was the greatest and most important form, wisdom was the highest level of knowledge, and the highest value was justice. In other words, the good life was wrapped up in the concept of social justice. Well, when we come to look at Aristotle's value theory, we're going to limit ourselves to a brief examination of what Aristotle saw as the good life and how that impacted society, what justice looked like and virtue, and then briefly morality and ethics, and a brief summary of his view on politics. So that brings us to the highest good. The highest good for Plato was justice. Aristotle saw the study of ethics, value theory, as an attempt to find our chief end or highest good, an end which he would suggest is really a final end, the very ultimate end and purpose of all of life. And the highest purpose for a human being is not justice in some abstract concept, as Plato saw it, but rather it's found in happiness. And that happiness is a unique kind of happiness. It's found in life and living, in work and family and society. We'll come back to that in a moment and flush that out a little bit. And that final chief end of life, happiness, I underscore again, it's not a conceptual thing. It's not an abstract thing. It's not something you can define as A, B, C, D, and E. Nor is happiness a mere experience that you have today or feeling happy today. It's much deeper than that. But at the same time, happiness has to be inherently practical, has to be human. But for Aristotle, it's very important that it's a sum total of the whole of a life. And so he begins one of his discussions and with an astonishing statement. He says, children, or a child, cannot be happy. And at first you go, well, I've got children, I've seen them happy. I'm sure I've seen them sad, but I've seen them happy. Watch them at Christmas as they open all the gifts. I mean, they're happy. And Aristotle would say, no, they're not. They have no basis for claiming that they're happy. In other words, it's the rational justification for their argument. How can a child justify they're happy? They've only lived this long. They have no basis on which to say, this proves or establishes and justifies my saying I'm happy. And happy for Aristotle means a life that's flourishing, that's lived well, and it has been a good life throughout the whole of life. And all of the actions of life should point to that end. And so to that end, he asks, how do we get there? And he argues that we have to think again about desires. He said there are acquired desires and there are natural desires. Now, acquired desires are different between. You'll have your acquired desires, I'll have mine. And natural desires are the same for us all. the correspondent wants, natural desires, food and so on. At least there's a commonality of natural desires. Acquired desires, he says, are a problematic kind of desire because the kind of good that they're seeking after is most times an apparent good. Whereas natural desires or needs correspond to real goods. In other words, it's a genuine good to need food. It's a good thing to need food and use it. That's a good end. Things that are good for you, food is good for you, whether you want them or not. So eat your peas on the plate, or eat your beans, or whatever it is that you don't like that's coloured green. With these considerations in mind, Aristotle makes this assertion. The good life consists in the possession, not the word possession, ownership, over the course of a lifetime, of all of those things that are really good. In other words, it's not till you see the whole of a life that you can talk about being happy. That's why a child cannot talk about being happy. And that moves us to the topic of virtue. And helps us understand that this word virtue is going to mean something far broader than simply a moralistic view of virtue. Aristotle argues the way to bridge the gap between knowledge of the good life and actually living it was by developing good moral character. In other words, moral character was the heart of the pathway that leads to happiness. Good habits or virtues are part of life. And he said there are two kinds of virtues. There are intellectual virtues and moral virtues. And he says moral virtues are the regular distribution. Moral virtues are the regular disposition to choose correctly those things which lead to a good life. Whereas intellectual virtues, again, is a disposition, choosing correctly. Now, the word disposition is important. If it's dispositions of character, which is moulded and shaped to do it intellectually, right, morally, because it chooses the good life. And he says moral virtues are interesting. So they're regulating virtues. Now, they can regulate our desires, but they have to be learned. But we can regulate our desires too much or too little. In other words, we need to find a balance between the good and the bad, between what's helpful and what's unhelpful. And regulating those virtues or character traits is not to be understood as either emotions or mental facilities, but an act of the will. And with that in mind, we can see the overall picture of where he's going. According to his doctrine of what's known as the moral mean, he says moral virtues are desire-regulating character traits which are lived at a mean between more extreme character traits. Now, the diagram you see in front of you is a good illustration of this. You have on one side excess, on the other side deficiency, and in the middle you have the mean. Rashness. Contrast that with courage. And cowardice. You can sense that that is in between the two extremes. I take vulgarity, for example, down the list a little bit. Interesting enough, vulgarity is one thing, pettiness is the other, and he says the in-between there is magnificence. In other words, magnity or magnanimity. And the list goes on. You can read through those lists. And there are a number of them. For example, down the bottom of the list, modesty. Shyness is the deficiency, is the excess, I beg your pardon, and shamelessness is the deficiency. Well, you can read the list. In other words, the phrase that's very Aristotelian in terms of ethics is the phrase which says, everything in moderation. Well, that's not quite right, because everything of these virtues lead to this good life and genuine happiness, as Aristotle would see it. Well, how do these values and virtues apply to the community at large? Well, Aristotle begins with a thesis, just in a sense like Plato, that human beings are naturally social animals. But he begins from a very different point of view than Plato. He says the state is a development from the family through the village to the city-state. In other words, the primary element of society is the family, the next is the village or small community, and then comes the city-state. And community life and the structure of are an offshoot of the family. The family is chronologically prior to the state, involves a series of husbands and wife, parent, child, master and slave. Aristotle regards slaves as a piece of property, having no existence except in relation to the master. Well, that's not something we'd see today, is it? In Aristotle's view, Plato's concept of communal ownership of wives and property, as sketched in the Republic, rests on a false conception of society. There's a sense in which Aristotle begins with a family and Plato with society. What is important is the family. For Aristotle, what is important for Plato is the state, and the structure of the state, which must have complete control over everything, whereas for Aristotle, it is the family and the well-being and the happiness of the family. Two really quite different conceptions. And that, of course, takes us to the forms of government. Now, here's the key in the red box. The purpose of society is to empower the individual's happiness. What's required? Well, such a place, such a society, needs to be defending individual freedom, enabling people to express the freedom of the will, to live virtuously, and to own goods. Remember, the happy life is acquiring all the goods necessary for a good life. And what's the right form of government? Well, it's a form of government that produces these freedoms. That's a true or valid form of government. Whereas the government doesn't provide those freedoms. It's a perverted form of government. And so we have the three true forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and constitutional republic. There are three corresponding perverted forms of government: tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. Now, what's interesting here is that both Plato and Aristotle, having lived in the world's first and perhaps most famous democracy, consider democracy to be a perverted form of government, but rather constitutional republic being at least acceptable. It's quite intriguing that should be their position. Of course, there's a world of difference in the forms of government. Aristotle sees, of course, monarchy, ruled by the one, or aristocracy, ruled by a few, and of course constitutional, ruled by many. And what makes the difference between the true and the perverted forms of government is where they stand on empowering and protecting and providing for the happiness of the family. So perhaps you'll hear echoes of the American form of government and constitution in this. Indeed, many of the founding fathers were very self-conscious of the views of Aristotle and the concept of a constitutional republic. Well, that brings us to a summary again of all things we've been looking at in terms of our friend Aristotle. Here's a summary again of things you need to know and understand. Draw your attention again to the worksheet. That's the key for you putting it all together and knowing what you need to know for tests and other things.